Thank you. Now please welcome our brother Eli to give the Purpose of Life sermon. You.
Hello, everyone. So it's one of those rare services where I'm the oldest person in the room. So it might change a bit how I give this service. If I'm honest, maybe I'm a little intimidated by the parents. It's always a little bit a weird thing trying to give a presentation or a service or a lecture to people who are older than you and probably heard it all before. So yeah, I think on the plus side, it keeps me humble. So maybe I'll be less humble today in how I give the service. But either way, I'm very happy to see you guys here. And I did want to start by just a kind of reminder. I think everyone's kind of aware that it's that all the events in Korea have started. So John, I think, left today, yesterday. So he should have arrived today. And I think Colum is going tomorrow. And, Ben and Kazuko will be there, I think, for the blessing. And Victoria is getting blessed. So he's a short time in our community, but, he's part of it. Victorio, the new Italian brother. Yeah. So the point is that, this is kind of a major event happening in Korea. And even though we're not there and we're not there in person, it's good to just make sure we're kind of praying for it. We're thinking about it. It's kind of in the back of our hearts and minds. And also, because we know we kind of have a special guest going, then we started the chain fasting condition yesterday, and we'll remind all the people who volunteered the day before. But it's never too late to volunteer because we're just going to do it for 8 days. So that was just a little I wanted to start there because it's somewhat related to my service, but I'll get back around to it towards the end, as I tend to do. So I chose the purpose of life today. I'm pretty sure it's kind of a common, phrase and expression that we use, especially in our movement. And I think if I ask anyone who's ever been to at least 3 DP workshops where they've covered chapter 1, and if you've been to any workshop, where they talk about the purpose of life, you kind of hear the same answer. I heard it many times in Sunday school. So if anyone asks me the purpose of life, it's almost an automatic response, right? We'll just test the crowd here. What's the purpose of life? Huh? Da-da-da-da-da. Nobody? You guys don't go to enough DP lectures. That's what's happening here. So it's,
Trigger blessings, huh? What's the purpose of life?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, more confidence, Tara. So the automatic response, the actual phrase is return joy to God. And the reason that's very important, and that's what it says in the principle, I checked, is that I often wonder, for us, it's a little bit automatic, bring joy to God, return joy to God. Maybe we say something like the 3 great blessings, which is a more kind of detailed explanation. But I often wonder, how would that sound to someone who hasn't heard the principle, right? How does that sound to someone on the street who's like, what's the purpose of life? Return joy to God. Like, what would they think of it, right? And the reason I often think, from an atheist perspective, if you're trying to convince people that don't believe in God, how do you help them to understand God? I know how the Christians view God. It's pretty clear. They have their very clear point of views. But when you talk about an atheist who hears return joy to God, it reminds me very much of one of the biggest criticisms of the Christian view of God, where a lot of people see God as very dictatorial, right? Here's my set of rules. If you follow them, you'll be saved and have happiness and love forever. If you don't, you will burn in hell and suffer and be tortured forever, right? And that seems very dictatorial if you're just kind of an atheist view. So I have to follow these rules just because you said so, right? And there's that philosophical question, is God good because good is inherent, or is God good because he determines what is good? It's like, is it just good because God says it's good? Otherwise it's bad. And that is actually oftentimes how Christianity portrays this idea of breaking the law, right? This is the law. If you break it, the wages of sin is death, right? So our default situation, we broke the law, so we're all going to die. And then Jesus comes and saves us, right? But that's the only way we can be saved. We'll always break the law. There's no self-redemption. So I think when you say return joy to God or bring joy to God, and it's interesting because it sounds a little bit like that, right? God's up here and is like, bring me joy, right? Give me joy. If you make me happy, then I'll reward you. But that's very different than the way we describe it and explain it, right? In the sense that, and that's why the word return, I think, is very important, because in order to return something to God, we need to have it ourselves, right? And that gets to the key element of how we try to describe the purpose of life, is that actually in order for God to feel joy, the people that he's receiving joy from need to also feel joy, right? That the people need to be happy for God to be happy. And so I often think about that, because I think the other aspect of realizing that is realizing that, okay, people aren't happy, so God's not happy, right? And that's quite a powerful explanation of the purpose of life. It's a very powerful explanation of God's heart. Okay, people are miserable and God is miserable. And that's the state of the world, right? And I think that's something that is very unique to the Unification Church and the Divine Principle, is this idea of how much God suffers because people suffer. And the other part of that explanation, the first line there in the Principle, when it talks about the purpose of life, says, return joy to God. It's how it's written in the Principle. And then the whole paragraph explains this balance of the purpose of the whole versus the purpose of the individual, right? And how they're completely dependent on each other, and that it needs to be ensured that both are taken care of, right? So I often wonder, because, fathers come, in the Bible, it's like the second coming comes and the kingdom of heaven comes, and Father made all these declarations. And even when we were celebrating the holy days, one of the holy days was the coronation of God's kingship. And God is now crowned King of the world, and fathers declared things like the end of indemnity. But at the end of the day, there's still suffering, right? And therefore God is still unhappy, right? God doesn't have is not really joyful, right? And I think when I think about it, the world today is obviously more joyful than the world ever in history. And I think that's where God feels joy, compared to how unhappy he's been for the last 10, 20,000 years since the fall of man. This is probably the happiest, comparatively, he's ever been. But he's still not happy, right? And that's very easy to know, because we just look at the world and ask what percentage of the world are happy and content and safe. And then that's probably around, roughly, how happy, content, satisfied God feels. So I think that relationship between the purpose of the whole and our individual happiness is so crucial to kind of the way we live our lives and the way we understand God and the way we relate with God. And I think it's also very unique, and I think it's important we understand, again, back to the point where we kind of automatically have a response, or we automatically are like, yeah, this is the purpose of life, in a very theoretical way. Actually, a lot of people don't have that balanced understanding of the purpose of life. If you study kind of philosophies on kind of happiness and what is happiness, what is purpose, you get a wide range, but almost all of them will pick one over the other, right? So you have the kind of extremes like communism, right? Where it's like the greater good philosophy, the ends justifies the means philosophy, right? So the idea here is that if you could measure the total amount of happiness in a country or in a group of people, then you try to maximize so that there's more happiness than sadness. And maybe that means you have to kill a few people, but then overall society will be better, right? And that's actually a very common belief. It's people who focus more on the idea of, you know, a nationalist improvement or a global improvement, right? They often ignore the value of the individual in that goal, right? It's very easy actually to sacrifice individuals with this idea of the greater good, right? The global benefit, or even in the church, even in religion, the providential benefit, right? If it's going to benefit the providence, it's okay if some people suffer, right? And then, but you have the opposite problem, right? Where you have these new age philosophies that say things like, you know, be your true self, right? Or you can't love anyone else until you really love yourself. And there's truth to that. It's not that those, both sides have truth to them, but the problem then is you ignore then the greater good. You ignore the problems in society. You ignore the things outside only your remit or what you can see directly, right? And so both extremes, and even if they're not extreme, even if they're unbalanced a little bit, then prevent people from being able to feel joy. And preventing people feeling joy is also preventing God from feeling joy. So I think the principle really finds this balance, at least in theory, right? And the principle is all theory, so it's okay. We're the ones who have to make it a reality. But in theory, it explains that these two need each other. If you are trying to accomplish a global goal and a global village vision that is going to sacrifice individuals against their will, then it will fail, right? If you're going to be an individual that's going to only focus on yourself and maybe on your immediate friends and family, then you will fail also to find happiness, right? There is a balance here that's incredibly hard to find, but absolutely necessary. And I think there's so this past week, if you guys didn't know, Brexit officially happened, right? And it's very topical for us because we're so close. We're kind of caught in the middle of the UK and the EU. And I find it very fascinating that even within our church, there's this kind of clear split on opinions, right? The British members are kind of all for Brexit, right? A big percentage of them. Whereas in kind of the European members, the Irish members, they're very much like, you know, the EU is kind of closer to God's ideal. It's about breaking down borders. It's about seeing people as one nation, right? And so it's an interesting kind of conflict. It's an interesting split of opinions. And I think it's still about balancing these two things. You know, in one sense, I can understand maybe, you know, someone who lives in Britain and feels like they're losing sovereignty to this overarching global or regional power, the EU, right? That makes decisions that then come down and forces them to follow them without their input, right? That they have a lot less control. And then the end result is that it affects their ability to live their lives, right? And I can give one very good example of this, which is in Scotland, they just passed a very extreme sexual education program that parents are not allowed to opt out of, which is kind of new in any country that has religious freedom, because you always have a kind of opt-out ability. And they're also trying to implement this in Ireland, in all the countries in the UK, and it comes from a very centralized European kind of curriculum for children, right? That's very secular, very sexualized, and they want to start from 3 years old to 16-year-old to have kind of a curriculum of what to teach kids, right? Just kind of ridiculous, especially when you go into the details of some of the things they propose. So it's really, that's just one example, right? So that's an example of the greater good, the higher purpose, trickling down and kind of sacrificing the kind of individuality of some of its members, right? It kind of goes against the concept of religious freedom, right? And self-determination. So in that sense, you can kind of understand where a group of people are like, we don't want to be dictated. We don't want to be controlled by a higher power, right? We want our own individual rights to express ourselves and to choose our curriculum and things like that, right? But at the same time, a lot of that sentiment coming out of Britain is on the opposite end, where they're doing the benefit of the whole over the individual on a nationalistic level, right? Where it's like, Britain needs to be Britain. We need to restrict immigration. We need to become, we need to maintain our culture and heritage. We need to keep people out that don't, want to be part of that culture and heritage. So it's kind of interesting because I feel like there's both good and bad emotions and motivations mixed in. But I still think it's almost a perfect example of trying to get a balance between the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual. And it's a very tough balance to make. And I don't think it's going to be a quick problem to solve, but I think it's a great example of things that are kind of always going on, right? And then there will be results from that, right? Some people their lives will become worse, and some people will feel like their lives have become better. And it's, from where we stand, we'll just never know exactly where it nets out unless something extreme happens. But because I'm an optimist, I always believe that anyway, despite little bumps here and there, God's providence moves forward, right? So if it goes back a bit, people learn, and then they fix it, and it moves forward, right? So who knows what will happen with Brexit, but I just thought it was fascinating, it's almost a perfect example of this conflict, right? People being individualistic, but kind of reacting to a feeling that they're losing their individualism or that they're being sacrificed for some greater good that they're not actually benefiting from. At the same time, almost being the reverse, right? Where they want to push their own national interests over the interest of individuals living in the country or trying to come in and live in the country, right? There's a similar thing in America, I think, that's happening, but that would be a whole different conversation. I have a lot of opinions about it, but I don't think it's as relevant. I think Brexit is just kind of fascinating in that way. But getting back to the point, and I think this is what really, this ties back to what I said at the beginning, is the real question is, how can we feel joy from helping things that are kind of outside directly impacting our joy? And this is the real challenge of trying to serve the whole, because I don't think we see or feel the joy right away, because usually those things that we do, anything that we do to kind of bring happiness outside ourselves, take a little bit of sacrifice, right? And so then it feels like actually we're sacrificing happiness, we're sacrificing joy in order to help someone else or help something else, right? And so then the question is, well, then how am I benefiting, right? I think I've used this expression before. In political science, there's this question, cui bono, and it's Latin for who benefits. And it's a very cynical expression because it's kind of saying everyone does politics for their own benefit, right? The only reason people do politics, the only thing countries do something is because they're trying to benefit their own country. Not something I believe in, but the reason I mention it, it's kind of though a relevant question when why should people be selfless? Why should people be altruistic if it doesn't bring them joy, if it doesn't bring them happiness? And it's the same with, if we have to be happy for God to be happy, then how does it bring God joy if we're suffering or making a sacrifice in order to, help someone else, right? Then we're still suffering, and so God is still going to suffer from our suffering. So I think this is a key question, and the reason I'm asking it is because of what's happening in Korea, right? What's happening in Korea is actually very far removed from us, right? It's a different, it's a different country. It's a bunch of conferences and meetings and, events and celebrations that in many ways, don't impact us directly, right? And it's not just this time, we do this twice a year. We have these big productions, the musical, which is, sometimes very boring for us Westerners to watch. It's very long and kind of weird sometimes, right? And then there's also, but then also in the past, there's been massive UPF conferences, right? There's been all these events, and we're kind of like, how do in a way, and I don't think it's an unfair question or a selfish question, how does that benefit us, right? Like, what's the purpose of us supporting those things and helping those things if at the end of the day, it's just kind of a sacrifice for the greater good? It seems on the surface to look like the greater good philosophy, right? We should sacrifice for the sake of the whole. And so I think about that a lot because oftentimes, doing mission or trying to help other people is at a cost to ourselves. And I think that's where you get into the idea of kind of this short-term versus long-term happiness, right? And we try to explain this in the introduction, right? When we talk about good desires lead to happiness and evil desires lead to suffering. But evil desires do lead to happiness short-term, right? Because no one desires anything that will make them unhappy, right? And the easiest example is kind of addiction, right? Addiction is kind of a short-term thing. You're happy in the moment, and then you're miserable afterwards, right? But I think if you expand that out to a wider scale, it's a similar thing, right? When you focus on problems outside yourself, then it does make you happier. And that's something I really believe it's kind of a core part of my faith. And I think it's something that is, it's up for everyone to kind of study and come to their own understanding. And I think people do. But I think it's something that the world as a whole doesn't quite understand as well, right? In that the actions you have to take to help other people or to serve a greater good. So let's say you volunteer to help some of these conferences, or you're investing some of your time or your money, then it actually builds your character in a way that you're happier. But it's not something you can see in the moment, right? It's not something you really can directly correlate with, oh, I tithe every week and now I'm a happier person, right? Even though I have less money. It's something that it's this kind of spiritual growth that's very hard to see. But I think when you look back, and I feel this very strongly when I kind of reflect on the things I did in my life that were really difficult and a bit of a sacrifice. And then now I'm a much happier person because of those things, because I had those experiences. I understand people better. Even my view on money is very different because I'm kind of always have this idea that I have to donate some of it, that I have to give some of it away, so I have to work with less. But also that I'm very happy to see the results then of when I donate money. So I think there's what I would call unseen ripple effects of when we serve the higher good and serve a higher purpose, right? I think that's true even with things like, coming to church, right? It's a bit of a sacrifice. You got to get up a little early. I know that everyone I know is sleeping in on Sunday, right? Everyone I know from work, they're waking up at 10, having a late breakfast, getting out of their pajamas at 2, right? Like, I know that's what they're doing. But I genuinely think that that's not as healthy, right? You're not as happy when more of your life is just kind of reactive, right? Instead of proactive. So I just want to give an example because the challenge with this is it's very hard to connect things that happen way outside of our remit to our own happiness, right? So all these kind of VIPs are going to Korea, former prime ministers, current members of parliament, and most of them don't really know what's going on. So for example, let's say there's a former prime minister from Ireland going to Korea, and he's just going because he's getting paid for it. It's like a little holiday for him and his wife. Of course, he's read up on the organization. Of course, he understands the general kind of theme, and he might enjoy it and like it. But it's not like he's really committed, right? But let's say he goes, he has a good experience, and there's one thing that inspires him. And then he comes back to Ireland, and that thing makes him interact with the people he knows in Ireland slightly differently, right? In a very positive way. Maybe he understands a little bit the dynamic of the freedom of religion versus a lot of the kind of social justice rights that are trying to be pushed, and he understands the balance there, and he pushes back a little, on very influential people that can make that decision, right? And so maybe in Ireland, unlike Wales, the law for that children education doesn't pass, right? And then my kids, when they're in those grades, they don't have to be exposed to some of those bad ideas, and then that makes their lives a little happier, right? That's just a small ripple, right? Of course, the ripple can be much larger, right? There's always a chance that a former prime minister could have a conversion experience and really understand and accept the true parents of the Messiah, and then commit all their time when they come home to promoting true parents. Not likely to happen that easily, and especially in Ireland. But the point is that without even having those people meet and have those discussions, we wouldn't know. And the other thing I think is very valid is I wanted to share this thing I read about on an atheist forum. I'm sorry, sometimes I think I give the impression that I'm an atheist. It's more like I like to keep tabs on them, what they're talking about, like a spy more like. But anyway, he was talking about he was traveling Africa, and he's an atheist, and he was traveling around Africa. When he came back, he's like, you know what? Africa needs Christianity. Because everywhere he went, the only place he saw where people were being taught to be kind of good citizens and not to be corrupt and to live for higher values was in the Christian churches, right? It was the Christian Africans he met that he felt were really doing the most to kind of reform and build up Africa. And the reason I mention that is I think that this is kind of what I mean by ripple effects, right? We live in a very stable country, and I've mentioned this many times, but the ripple effects that let us get here were from the Christian missionaries and the Christian nations and the Christian base that taught people to try to live not just for themselves, right? Taught people to love their neighbor and try to be more giving and caring and to consider things outside just their own happiness, right? And so because of that, if you compare the world back then to now, we're all happier. Whether we're atheists, whether we believe in Christianity, no matter what we're doing, we're all happier because some people were willing to live, for a greater good, right? And if we could turn a switch right now and everyone could stop being selfish, the world would be at peace, right? The world would be happy. It's not going to happen that way. That's completely unrealistic. But the point is, people can't see the future. And one of the biggest causes of unhappiness is our own ignorance about what would even make us happy. And I guess the key point I'm making is just living for yourself will not make you happy, right? That's the point about the balance between the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual, is you have to serve the whole to find happiness in yourself. In the same way that the whole, the higher purpose, the nation, the world, cannot succeed if it doesn't guarantee your happiness at the same time. So that's the kind of balance and the challenge we face. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I mentioned the example of like my kids going to school, which is something I worry about actually a lot. I think every parent worries about it. When you have kids, this concept of longer term happiness becomes much, much more obvious, right? Because actually, once you have kids, you care a lot less about your own happiness. And what you really want to make sure is that, when you die, your kids are happy. That's kind of the main thought in my head these days, right? Even when I think of my own parents and their passing, I think they're probably okay. They're probably mostly happy because we're happy, like we're okay, right? We're all married and we're mostly settled. Maybe my brother's got a few emotional issues he's working with and family issues, and I want to really help him with that. And of course, all of us have our own problems. But I think if my parents were looking down, they'd be mostly happy. Right? We kind of turned out okay. None of us ended up in prison. We're all kind of making our own families. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Gotta start paying my taxes. So this is I think the point is that when we look at family, then it's so much more obvious, right? That as a family, you really want the world around your family to be safe and happy, right? I often think, okay, I have my kids, they have kids, and then they have kids. And then imagine like there's another kind of genocide type of thing, right? where all the Moonies in the world are killed, or something like that. Then it almost doesn't matter, right? Like my life didn't really matter. The things I did didn't matter. Like the world has to be a better place, right? The world has to be a place where our kids can grow up and be happy. Otherwise, it's all temporary, right? It all has no real value if it's not sustainable, right? So that's what I think of when I think of what Mother's doing in Korea. You know, I know a lot of that anyway comes down to what we do at home, right? Our own community and stuff. And it's always good to focus on that. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that what Mother's trying to influence is these kind of ripple effects across the world, right? And I don't know how many other conferences bring together these kind of people in one room. And I don't know what kind of results can come out of it. But I really believe that it's when people are coming together at that level and talking about kind of God-centered values, I think we're going to see incredibly positive ripple effects out of that, right? And that's why I would just encourage everyone, especially this week, to just really try to bring this more to the forefront of our prayers, of our hearts. Like what's happening in Korea is a kind of turning point for a lot of people. And I think it's important we really try to offer as much as we can, even if it's just this week, towards what's happening there. Like not to ignore it, not to just think of it as something over there. I mean, never mind all the people getting blessed, right? That's going to be life-changing events for them. But I mean the conferences, I mean the Sanak Peace Prize, I mean Ban Ki-moon is getting an award. There's a lot of stuff going on there that's kind of way outside of things we would normally care about. But I'm saying let's make an effort to care about them because, you know, because it's Mother and because actually we should recognize it will benefit us. It will make us happier if it's successful. And that was the main point I really wanted to make today, right? It's very easy for us to ignore what happens kind of too far away from us. And also it's practical for us to ignore things that are too far away of us. Otherwise we'd just be worried all the time or we wouldn't be effective in our own lives. But I think every now and then we really should remember how interconnected we all are. And we should really think of and pray for these things happening, especially because it's under True Parents, especially because it's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime event. You know, let's really offer up our hearts and our efforts to support this, even though we're far away, right? And that's the message I wanted to share, especially because John and Colum, our brothers, are there. They have kind of a really special mission today to take care of. So let's really do our best, at least spiritually, at least internally, to think of them, to pray for them, to care for them. And I think that'll make us all happier people, right? I do. And I think the results of this, you know, maybe it'll take 5, 10, some results may take 20 years to see, but I think we'll all be around here in 5, 10, hopefully 20 years. So, you know, it does.
Look over here.
I did, yeah, sorry. I'd say,
You're longer than you.
I hope so, James. I hope so. But I hope that's because you live so long that I still get to live long. Not that I get hit by a bus tomorrow or something, which is always a possibility. So I wanted to close, you know, I made this point about Christians in Africa. And I think that's also relevant to the events we've held in Africa, right? But I think that I want to read this quote from the Bible because I think it's very much embodies the spirit of Christianity, one of the core principles of Christianity that helped Christianity change the culture of the world, right? Which to me is the core reason we can live the way we live, right? So I just want to read this quote because I just think it's very powerful, and it's this kind of concept is kind of the core of this balance between our individual happiness and the happiness of others. So just to explain the context, because I don't want to read the whole thing, Jesus is talking, he's giving a parable about the last days when the Lord returns. And he says he'll call all the people together, and he'll have those that are good and those that are bad. And he'll say to the righteous, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you? When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick and in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly I say to you, insomuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. So, yeah, I think that's just a very powerful message that Jesus was sharing at a time when people did not think that way, right? Those words from Jesus changed the way people thought about this point. And my point is that even without them understanding it or doing it for their own joy, it did bring them more joy, right? And that's kind of my point, is that this balance is we have to serve others. We have to live for the sake of others if we want to be happy. And it's very hard for us to see the direct cause and result, but the more we practice it, the more obvious I think it becomes. So on that note, thank you, everyone. I'll end with a prayer. Sarang Manashin Hanal Bumonim. Our dear, beloved, and precious Heavenly Parent, as always, we're grateful for the lives that we have and the short time we have on this earth. We pray that we can always put our Heavenly Parent as our guiding light and guiding direction. We know that in order to be happy, that we can't just follow our own desires and our own concepts, but we really must be humble and seek out the kind of highest standard of love and joy, gratitude. Because when people try to just make themselves happy, we've seen time and time again throughout history, but even in our own lives, that if the focus is on our own happiness, we tend to be less and less happy, less and less successful. But when we broaden that scope, when we start to see the people around us as brothers and sisters under the same parent, then we really find true joy, true love, true relationships. So we pray especially at this time and this week for our brothers and sisters in Korea. They're for many different purposes and reasons, but all seeking out a deeper understanding of love and a deeper understanding of life and their relationship with you. We know there in Korea there will be many, many former heads of states and current members of parliament, a couple even current heads of state. And they're not there we're not asking them there just to maybe network a little bit and have a good time. But the real goal and the real purpose is to understand your heart, understand their responsibility as influential people, that their words can really move many people at once, even entire nations. So we pray as a greater human family, we can really get closer to that ideal. We can start to forgive each other more and give each other more opportunities. And although I really believe the world has been improving every year, more people finding happiness and love and purpose to their lives, still we know it's too slow and there's still a long way to go. So I pray each of us here in this room, and even those who weren't able to be here today, each of us can always be vigilant to keep a heart of love and forgiveness, to strive for the highest ideals despite our own shortcomings and fallen natures. And we pray now that after our service today, we can go down and share some communal time together, having lunch, chatting, just coming to understand each other a little bit better. So we thank you for this time, this life we have. We report these things in our names, in the name of Young-il and Vicky Lowe, of Blessed Central Family. Achu. Achu. Okay, thank you. I'll give it back to Vika.
Thank you, Lai. will now